Well, I'm here to tell you it's not. Grocery store shelves are starting to look how they did at the beginning of the pandemic. Missing items, signs from grocery store owners telling customers they can only purchase one of a certain item, and the prices, let's not even get started there. Cost of staples like dairy and meat have just been skyrocketing, and that's, again, if you can actually get them. So joining us now is Damien Mason, farm owner, an agricultural economist, and author of Food Fear. Damien, thank you so much for being here. What is driving the shortage that so many of us are seeing when it comes to food items right now?
Well, thanks for having me, Alicia. Remember, economically speaking, there's no such thing as shortages. There's just shortfalls in supply, which of course then jacks up prices, which is what we're seeing. The shortages are really a sad commentary for especially people at the lower end of the economic spectrum, because we are still making the food out here in America's farms. Our beef production, our dairy production, our vegetable production, our grain production is, near record high. The problem, of course, is in the middle, and that's where we've been for a long time. Getting those things, especially that require a lot of hands-on. If it's simple stuff that doesn't take as much hands-on in processing, it's probably going to be more available and less impacted by the inflation. But when you start to need more and more human hands and more handling, you're going to add up the numbers. And that's where the struggle is. It's all about the middle, as it has been really now for the last year and a half.
What is specifically causing the supply chain problems that we're seeing as it relates to, as you poignantly point out, not a shortage, but a mismatch in supply and demand? Is it, simply the labor issues that we've been seeing, or is it multifactorial?
Yeah, multifactorial, but the big one, of course, comes down to the human hands that were, having to do the work. I spoke at a conference, one of the largest poultry producers in the country this week, and they talked about poultry prices going up 11% year over year, and that's actually not as bad as some categories. But, beef being 18%. Remember, to take a chicken and then make it so that you can put it on the dinner plate, there's a lot of steps that happen. You've got to haul that chicken. You've got to then butcher that chicken, cut it into pieces, etc. And that company talked about how much they're having to pay more, bid up the price of labor to get people to come in and do that work, because of the fact that we've got a lot of people that are being paid to not work, frankly. There's another concern also. When plants can't run at capacity, Alicia, you have this issue like Tyson came out a week or so ago, biggest poultry processor in the world, and said, you know what, we're producing 5 days of supply, but it's taking us 6 days to do that because we can't run at capacity. So when you start thinking about those sorts of bottlenecks, you're going to then obviously have a shorter amount of supply coming out the end to the consumer, which is really going to, I think, be a long time straightening out.
Yeah. I know that hoarding items is obviously warned against, but realistically, given some of these, mismatch again in supply and demand, should people be stocking up on hard to find items?
Well, of course, I'm a farm boy. I'm the youngest of 9 children. We had a 1-acre garden. We raised a hog or 2 every year. We butchered a steer, and we had our own milk on the dairy farm. So I'm all about having supplies, jars and cans and frozen goods. And the reality is we should always do that, because it's just a matter of, it gives you autonomy. It also gives you security, and you sleep better at night. Should you be hoarding? Well, remember what happens with the human psyche. Once, Alicia, you start thinking, oh gosh, we're not going to have this stuff, then the fear sets in. We saw it with toilet paper, for crying out loud. And was there ever a time in your life until a year and a half ago you thought you'd go without? The reality is the supply chain's pretty resilient. We do, especially in agriculture, we produce the heck out of stuff. Maybe you trade down a little bit. Instead of that high value added stuff, if you're concerned about it, you go down to something that's not had as much human touch, meaning it doesn't have as much packaging and processing, or it has maybe less, you get something that's not as boned and cured, and you do that yourself. There's a time for some of us that are old enough to remember when economic shock happened and inflation was going on, we switched off. I don't know if a lot of people can remember the generics. I brought in these just for fun. I'm a Coors drinker. This is a vintage Coors can about 1980, when this would have been a really cool can and also a really cool beer. But if you couldn't afford that, you switched over to generic. Anybody remember these? You just went to the store and bought beer. So maybe the consumer, and I'm not making light of anybody that's, economically impacted by this, could switch down a little bit. I'll give you a couple of fun facts, Alicia. In the United States, we still last year and a half, 2 years ago, before this pandemic started causing our problems, we still have the cheapest food in the world at 6.4% of our gross income being spent on feeding ourselves. That's the cheapest in the world, as opposed to the poor Nigerian who spends 55% of her gross income on food. So if prices do go up more than 5%, which it looks like they are across most categories, and certainly in things like meat, it's up double digit and then some. Is there going to be some concern? Yes, but we still do have the cheapest food supply in the world, which helps us.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't feel like that at the moment, but the data shows otherwise, right? You mentioned items that have kind of fewer human touch, fewer packaging and processing, being probably easier to come by. But we are hearing stories like people, I think in Denver, Colorado, unable to purchase milk. Why are certain items in certain regions of the country, certain areas of the country, harder to find?
Yeah, generally with regionality is because of the amount of processing that happens there. You know, if there's one milk processor that handles all of that story that you're speaking of was specifically about like the half pints that children would get in the school system. So a lot of times what happens is everybody sort of divides up what they're good at. We're really good at putting milk into half pint containers, and oh crap, we had our supplier couldn't get us those little cartons, so now we can't put as much milk in cartons, and therefore nobody else has those cartons. That's usually what happens. You know, a great story, not a great story, a story that illustrates this point was the national pork producers is talking about the fact that they can get the pork raised, the pigs are raised on the farms, and then they can get them slaughtered. And then when it comes time to putting them on the package, a little styrofoam tray like you'll see at the store, we don't have the styrofoam trays. So you've got the pig on the farm, you've got the processor plant working, you've got the employees showing up, and then you don't have the styrofoam tray. Makes you wonder, will this change our packaging?
Yeah.
Will there be larger pieces of pork?
I want to talk to you for a minute about John Deere, the strike that we see there happening, notably during harvest season. I would imagine it could potentially, impact a farmer who may need a supply, may need a part for, a certain piece of gear that's going to help during harvest season. What impacts do you see this potentially having?
You talk about inflation. The Farm Belt in general, with the exception of tree-raised products and fattened beef, those are the two categories in the entire marketplace that were struggling a bit. But in general, corn, soybeans, a lot of agriculture is actually having a very good year. When a farmer makes good money, what would they like to do? They would like to go and then upgrade their equipment, buy a new John Deere tractor, for instance. And if they have a shortage of supply, that means they either don't buy or they bid up the price. So now machinery, farm machinery, is going to be bid up. As you pointed out, it's not just the new combine or the new tractor. It could also be, hey, I'm going to stick with the machine I have, but I need to do $20,000 of improvements to it. I need some new parts. Oh, goodness. Now they're not available either. So this really sort of throws some gas on the fire of machinery and equipment parts inflationary pressure.
Always with keen insight here, and I think for the average consumer, even for the farmers out there, right, hoping that some of these supply chain issues ease up and this inflation that we're dealing with also eases up. Keen insight there. Thank you so much for being here again. Damien Mason, farm owner, agricultural economist, and author of Food Fear.